Imagine earning $50,000 a year and still being just one rent hike away from eviction. This isn't just a coastal problem anymore. From Phoenix to Pittsburgh, rent has morphed into a second tax on survival. More than half of all renters in the US are now considered rent-burdened, meaning they spend over 30% of their income on housing. For many, it's closer to 50%. The question is no longer, where can I afford to live? But can I afford to live at all? And as wages stagnate, remote work fades, and housing construction stalls, we're forced to confront a deeper tension. Has America turned into a place where we merely earn to exist, not to live? It's not just happening in New York or San Francisco anymore. Rent is crushing people everywhere. Cities once considered affordable, like Charlotte, Boise, Nashville, even parts of the Midwest, are now facing rent spikes that feel almost surreal. And it's not a small shift. It's a structural squeeze that's reshaping how Americans live. According to a recent report from Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, over 22 million renter households in the United States are now officially cost-burdened. That means they spend more than 30% of their income just on rent. And out of that group, nearly 12 million households are considered severely burdened, paying more than half of what they earn just to keep a roof over their heads. Let that sink in. Imagine taking home $3,000 a month and watching $1,500 disappear before you even pay your phone bill, car insurance, or buy groceries. In places like Miami, Austin, Phoenix, and Atlanta, rents have jumped by as much as 30 to 40% since the pandemic. And while prices have cooled off slightly since the 2022 peak, they're nowhere near affordable again. In many of these cities, the so-called normalization still means paying $2,000 or more for a one-bedroom apartment, even if local salaries haven't kept up. But this isn't just an urban issue anymore. Smaller cities and towns are seeing the same pressure. In Boise, Idaho, average rents rose by more than 60% between 2020 and 2023. Why? Because people fled from California and Seattle during the pandemic, driving up demand in these quieter, cheaper towns. The result? Locals, teachers, bartenders, warehouse workers, are now being priced out of the very places they've lived their entire lives. Meanwhile, mega investors have quietly taken over the housing market. Companies like Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, and Blackstone have scooped up entire neighborhoods of single-family homes. In some zip codes, especially in the South, over 20% of all home purchases in recent years were made by institutional landlords. Not people buying homes to live in, but corporations buying homes to rent out. And that changes the game. These firms use sophisticated pricing algorithms that adjust rent dynamically, often pushing prices up faster than the market or local wages can handle. What used to be a handshake agreement with a mom-and-pop landlord is now a digital notification that your lease is up, and your rent's going up another $300. On top of that, affordable housing is disappearing. Nearly 5 million low-cost rental units have been lost nationwide over the past decade, not because people moved out, but because buildings were demolished, flipped, gentrified, or removed from subsidy programs. Once those units are gone, they don't come back. And as pandemic-era rental assistance programs have ended, evictions are surging again. In places like Houston, Las Vegas, and Tampa, eviction filings are now above pre-COVID levels, despite lower unemployment. In some southern states, nearly 15% of renters are behind on payments as of early 2025. So where do people go when they can't pay? Some move in with family, others move further out, into rural areas with no jobs. And some become part of America's invisible crisis, the working homeless. These are folks with jobs, Amazon drivers, substitute teachers, restaurant workers who sleep in their cars or bounce between motels because they simply can't find an apartment they can afford. This is the new normal for millions of Americans, not a temporary blip, not a coastal problem, but a national reality. You can work full-time and still not afford to live anywhere near where you work. And that simple truth is shaking the foundation of what Americans have long believed, that if you work hard, you should be able to live with some dignity. So, how did we get here? The simple answer is, rent is rising because housing is broken. But the real answer is layered, a mix of policy failures, market distortions, and years of ignoring the warning signs. Let's start with the most basic issue: supply and demand. The US just hasn't been building enough housing, not for years. According to Freddie Mac, by 2023, America was short by more than 3.8 million homes, and that's just to meet current demand, not future growth. We're talking about a deficit that took more than a decade to build, especially after the 2008 housing crash when home builders pulled way back and never fully recovered. Meanwhile, household formation hasn't stopped. People are still moving out, starting families, switching cities, going to school, and many of them are forced into the rental market because buying a home is now out of reach. Especially with mortgage rates floating around 6 or 7%. So renters pile in, demand explodes, and with limited supply, prices soar. But here's where it gets more complicated and more structural. In cities all across America, zoning laws are stuck in the past. Local rules often ban multi-family units, limit density, or require excessive parking, making it nearly impossible to build the kind of affordable housing that growing populations actually need. Try to put up an apartment building in a single-family neighborhood, and you'll run into public hearings, lawsuits, and years of delays. That's not just a big city problem. That's happening in suburban counties, small towns, even rural areas with shrinking populations. It's called NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and while it's driven by different motivations, some racial, some financial, some just fear of change, the result is the same: less housing, higher rents. Now add in the effects of the pandemic. When COVID hit, a massive wave of remote workers fled expensive cities, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and landed in cheaper metro areas, Austin, Nashville, Tampa, Boise. Great for them, devastating for locals. A flood of outside money bidding up rent in places that weren't built to absorb it. And here's something most people don't realize. Wall Street saw all of this coming. Over the past decade, investment firms started snapping up rental properties, not just apartment buildings, but single-family homes. In fact, some zip codes in the Sun Belt now have entire neighborhoods owned by corporate landlords. These firms don't just raise rent, they extract fees, automate lease renewals, and reduce services to maximize profit. And because they operate across hundreds of thousands of units, they set the tone for the broader market. This is the financialization of housing, where homes aren't seen as shelter, but as assets to be traded, bundled, and leveraged like stocks. And when housing becomes a commodity, people get priced out. Now let's talk about costs. Even when developers want to build, they're up against a brutal cost structure. Construction costs have spiked, driven by labor shortages, supply chain disruptions, and material inflation. Lumber, cement, drywall, everything is more expensive. Add in interest rates, which the Fed has kept high to fight inflation, and suddenly it's harder and riskier to finance new projects. That's why, as of 2025, multifamily housing starts are down more than 20% year over year. So fewer new units, higher borrowing costs, delayed construction. Meanwhile, the population keeps growing. You don't need an economics degree to see where that leads. And here's the final piece. Wages haven't kept up. Not even close. While headline numbers might show wage growth, the reality is that real median income adjusted for inflation has barely moved since 2020. In some cases, it's gone backward, and for low-wage workers, the squeeze is brutal. If rent goes up by $300 a month, but your paycheck only increases by $50, you fall behind, fast. In other words, this isn't just a housing crisis, it's a labor market crisis, a zoning crisis, a capital market crisis, all converging at once. And Americans are stuck in the middle, trying to survive a system that wasn't built for the realities of 21st century life. So when people say, why don't they just move? The better question might be, move where? And with what money? Because when there's nowhere affordable to go, and nothing left after rent, the problem isn't just personal, it's structural. And it's nationwide. This rent crisis, it's not just hitting a few unlucky people. It's reshaping the entire American experience, from how we live, to when we move out, to whether we ever feel secure. And it's cutting across lines of age, geography, race, and income, but not evenly. Let's start with young adults. In past generations, getting your own place by your early 20s was a rite of passage. Not anymore. As of late 2024, more than 50% of Americans under age 30 are still living with their parents. And this isn't about laziness or a lack of ambition. It's math. If you're a 26-year-old making 45 grand a year and your rent is $1,800 a month, you're broke before you can even start saving. Even folks with decent jobs, teachers, nurses, entry-level tech workers, are finding that they simply can't move out unless they split rent, live far from work, or settle for unsafe or overcrowded conditions. Then, there's the single parents and seniors on fixed incomes, two groups getting absolutely hammered by this market. For example, eviction filings against renters over age 55 have surged by nearly 30% since before the pandemic. Social Security and disability checks haven't come close to keeping pace with inflation, especially in places where rents have doubled in 5 years. The working poor, who've always been at the edge of the affordability cliff, are falling off it now. Many service workers, think janitors, cooks, childcare providers, are being priced out of entire metro areas. In Los Angeles, for example, it's estimated that a worker earning minimum wage would need 3 full-time jobs just to afford the average one-bedroom. And don't assume rural areas are a safe haven. In towns across the South and Midwest, people are facing a different kind of squeeze. Because while housing may still be cheaper on paper, wages are lower, jobs are fewer, and landlords are still hiking rent to match out-of-town demand. In parts of Tennessee and Kentucky, families who used to pay $600 a month are now paying over $1,200 without any significant change in local income. Then there's the new class of Americans we don't talk about enough, the working homeless. These are people with jobs, sometimes even full-time, who sleep in cars, couch surf, or live in extended-stay motels. Cities like Denver, Las Vegas, and Orlando are reporting growing numbers of individuals who show up for shifts at retail stores or hospitals and return home to a parking lot. Add to that the undocumented workforce, often left out of rental assistance or legal protections, now doubling or tripling up in illegal units or sleeping in uninsulated garages just to avoid the streets. These are the people who pick the food, clean the buildings, care for children, yet they're living in the shadows of a housing market that doesn't even recognize their existence. And we haven't even mentioned the middle class, because yes, even they're being reshaped. People making 6 figures in cities like Seattle or Boston are renting longer, delaying kids, skipping homeownership altogether. Why? Because the down payment on a median-priced home now feels like winning the lottery. Meanwhile, rent hikes eat away any chance to save. This is the new chain reaction. People stay in rentals longer, fewer homes go up for sale, young people can't leave home, family units strain under pressure. Older adults can't downsize affordably, no turnover in suburban housing stock. Landlords sense scarcity, they raise prices even more. The market is frozen, but not in place, in tension. Everyone's stuck, everyone's squeezed. So when we ask who's affected, the honest answer is almost everyone, just in different ways. For the poor, it's eviction. For the working class, it's trade-offs and fear. For the middle class, it's downward mobility. For cities and towns, it's the slow erosion of their workforce and their soul. And when the people who teach, nurse, clean, cook and care can't live in the places they serve, what does that mean for the future of any community? You can look at charts, you can read reports, but the reality of the rent crisis doesn't hit you until you hear it from the people living it. Take Amanda, a 32-year-old nurse in Houston. She works long shifts at a public hospital, sometimes 12 hours, sometimes 16. I'm not lazy, I'm not broke, but I still can't afford to live near where I work, she says. I rent a 1-bedroom in Pasadena because it's $700 cheaper than anything near the medical center, but it adds an hour to my commute each way. That's 2 unpaid hours of my life every single day. Then there's Carlos and Lydia, a married couple with 2 kids in San Diego. They've lived in the same apartment for 5 years. In 2020, their rent was $1,800 a month. Today, it's pushing $2,900. Carlos is a delivery driver. Lydia works part-time at a school cafeteria. We've stopped using the 3rd bedroom, Carlos says. We all sleep in the 2 small ones and rent the extra out to another guy. It's the only way we make rent. Mia, in Boise, tells a different version of the same story. She moved back to her hometown after graduating college, hoping for a fresh start somewhere she could afford. But it's not the Boise I left. People from LA bought everything. Rent used to be $900, now it's $1,700. I work remotely for a tech company and still have to rent a room. A full room in someone's basement. And then there's Reverend Thomas in Atlanta, whose church now runs a small overnight shelter in the basement. 10 years ago, we served the unemployed, the mentally ill, the chronically unhoused. Now we've got Amazon drivers and school janitors sleeping on cots. They have jobs, they're just out of options. On TikTok, the stories pour in daily. People filming their eviction notices. Young professionals showing off their tiny studio apartments for $2,400 a month. Single moms sitting in cars explaining how they work 2 jobs and still might not make rent. One woman broke down on camera saying, "I did everything right. I went to school, I got a job, and I still feel like I'm failing." Even Reddit threads, usually full of sarcasm, have turned raw. A post in r/poverty finance reads, 33 software engineer, making over 6 figures, still renting, still no savings. I don't know what else I'm supposed to do. And these aren't isolated voices. They echo each other. People are cutting corners wherever they can, cancelling health insurance, skipping car repairs, living without air conditioning, moving in with relatives they barely talk to, sharing apartments with strangers. One woman in Tampa wrote, "I rent a 1-bedroom with 2 other people. We take turns sleeping in the bed. I call it the hot bunk. For millions, dignity has become a luxury. Privacy is gone. Stability is a memory. And hope? That's fading too. Because when your entire paycheck goes to rent and you still can't keep up, you start asking yourself, what's the point of working at all? This isn't just a housing issue. It's not even just an affordability issue. It's a redefinition of what it means to live in America. Because the promise was never just about freedom or opportunity. It was about possibility. The belief that if you work hard, you should be able to live somewhere decent, raise a family, maybe buy a home, build a future, not just survive, not just hold on. But today, for millions of Americans, work no longer guarantees shelter. Paychecks disappear into rent. Cities function on labor they can't afford to house. People who do everything right, who follow the rules, who show up, who grind every week, still find themselves falling behind. And what we're left with is a quiet erosion, not of jobs, not of buildings, but of trust. Trust in the idea that this country still works for regular people. So what happens next? That depends on more than markets or interest rates. It depends on whether we're willing to confront a hard truth. If America becomes a place where full-time work no longer buys a place to live, is it still a nation of opportunity, or just a machine we clock into until we burn out? There's no easy answer to that. But the question is already living rent-free in the minds of millions. Thanks for spending this time with us today. If this episode made you pause, reflect, or feel a little less alone in your own housing journey, then it did its job. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're real lives, real paychecks, real stress. And whether you're renting a shoebox apartment in Brooklyn, sharing a house in Dallas, or living with family in Ohio, know this: you're not the only one asking hard questions about what's fair, what's broken, and what comes next. We'll keep digging into these stories, bringing you the facts, the voices, and the deeper forces shaping life in America today. Until next time, I'm your name, and this is Observer Malik. Stay sharp, stay grounded, and don't stop asking, what kind of country are we becoming if living here costs everything?